I thought I knew everything about my wife after 30 years of marriage, until I opened that locked case. What I found inside didn't just break my heart, it shattered the life we'd built together. Joan and Richard had been a part of each other's lives since high school, and their friendship eventually grew into a nearly 30-year marriage. Richard worked as a software developer, while Joan thrived in her role as a hospital lab technician. Together, they built a life centered on shared goals and mutual respect. Over the years, however, Richard began noticing subtle changes in their relationship. Joan seemed more distant, which worried him, but he chalked it up to the pressures of her job. Recently, her behavior had become more secretive and distracted. Still, Richard trusted her and decided not to press her about it. What Richard didn't know was that Joan was wrestling with her emotions. A connection from her past had resurfaced, leaving her caught between the life she'd built and the pull of something unresolved. Meanwhile, she had planned a getaway with her sister, Brenda, hoping the trip would bring her clarity. On the morning of Sunday, October 3, 2010, as Joan and Brenda prepared to leave for the airport shuttle, Richard saw them off with a mix of fondness and optimism. "Enjoy yourself, and don't worry about me. I'll be fine," he said with a wink. Joan smiled warmly, but before she could reply, Brenda quipped, "Just don't let your sister get into trouble." Joan smirked. "I'll behave, Brenda," she retorted playfully before turning to Richard. "I'll be back in 2 weeks, and I expect the house to still be standing. Be careful, and remember, I love you more than anything." She kissed him deeply, her words carrying an extra layer of emotion that Richard didn't quite pick up on. Brenda, already in the van, impatiently called out, "Come on. We've got a plane to catch." Joan glanced back at Richard one last time, mouthing "which" at her sister while Richard chuckled. "Bye, hon, I love you too," he said, watching as the van pulled away. As the vehicle disappeared down the street, Richard muttered under his breath with a grin, "Finally, they're gone." He wasn't relieved for the reasons Joan might suspect. Instead, he was brimming with excitement about a surprise he'd been planning for weeks. Over the next few days, he and their son, Mark, would completely remodel the master bedroom into Joan's dream sanctuary, something she'd once pointed out in a magazine. It was to be his grand 30th anniversary gift, and the timing of Joan's Caribbean cruise was perfect for pulling it off. Richard wasted no time, immediately calling Mark. "Let's get moving. We've got a lot to do, painting, replacing the carpet, building the furniture, the works." Together, they began packing up the bedroom, relocating everything to the spare room. Richard started with the dresser, nightstands, and armoire, leaving the biggest task for last, clearing out their 2 massive walk-in closets. Over the years, both he and Joan had filled them with an array of items, old tools, sentimental keepsakes, school papers, and everything in between. Sorting through it all was a daunting but necessary step for the surprise. Richard let out a long sigh and braced himself as he stepped into his own closet. It took nearly an hour, but he eventually managed to pack everything up and move it to the spare room. Feeling accomplished, he turned his attention to Joan's closet, a far more overwhelming task. Just standing at the entrance, he was struck by the sheer volume of stuff they'd accumulated over 3 decades. Mark interrupted his thoughts by walking in with a bag of food. "Hey, I brought you lunch," he called out, only to trip over a stack of boxes. "Geez, knock or something next time," Richard exclaimed, clutching his chest in mock exasperation. "You almost gave me a heart attack." "Sorry, Dad," Mark replied sheepishly, handing over a sandwich and soda. The two sat down on the bed amidst the chaos and ate in silence, both contemplating the mountain of work still ahead. For 15 minutes, they took a break from the renovations, unaware of the discoveries that awaited them in Joan's closet. Richard glanced at Mark as they stood amid the disorganized piles of items from Joan's closet. "All right," he said, "I'll pack the small stuff while you move the larger items to the spare room. Then we'll haul the furniture to the garage for Goodwill, okay?" Mark nodded, giving his usual short response. Without further discussion, they got to work. Richard carefully packed clothes, shoes, and smaller belongings into boxes, while Mark handled the heavier loads, carrying them out of the room. Midway through, Mark noticed a small, dusty case sitting on a high shelf. Pulling it down, he asked, "What's this?" Richard recognized it immediately as part of an old luggage set that had belonged to Joan's late mother. "Oh, that's from her mom," he replied, attempting to open it. The latches wouldn't budge. "Looks like it's locked." "Just put it with the other stuff for now," he added. Clearing out Joan's closet turned into a 2-hour ordeal. Afterward, they took a short break before dismantling the old furniture, hauling each piece into the garage to prepare for donation. By dinner time, both men were completely spent. Richard handed Mark $20 for a pizza run, and they cracked open a couple of cold beers from the fridge to wind down. After dinner, Mark decided to head home, mindful of not upsetting his wife, Brandy, with his extended absence. Richard stayed back, cleaning up the room and prepping the walls for the next phase of the project. By 9 p.m., the taping, plastering, and sanding were done. Exhausted, he grabbed another beer and collapsed into his lounge chair, falling asleep almost instantly. Monday, October 4th. The next morning, Mark arrived promptly at 7 a.m., as promised. They quickly ate bowls of cereal before diving into the day's task, painting. "Today's all about painting," Richard said, laying out the plan. "I'll handle the high spots, and you do the lower ones. No matter how late it gets, we need to finish this." Mark nodded, mentioning that Brandy would be at her mother's all day, so there were no interruptions on his end. They spent the day working tirelessly, stopping only for water and quick breaks. By the time they wrapped up, Richard was utterly drained. After a shower, he grabbed another beer and passed out in front of the TV. Tuesday, October 5th. The carpet installation crew arrived bright and early at 6 a.m., leaving Richard with little to do but stay out of their way. He made himself breakfast and watched in amazement at how quickly the professionals worked. By 10 a.m., the carpet was installed, and Richard found himself with a brief window of free time before the new furniture delivery at noon. With nothing else pressing, he returned to the spare room to organize the piles of items. There, the beige cosmetics case caught his eye again. Picking it up, he noticed it felt heavier than expected. Curiosity piqued, he fetched a paperclip and began fiddling with the locks. Before he could get it open, the doorbell rang, announcing the furniture delivery. Richard quickly set the case aside and directed the movers, showing them where to place the pieces. Once the delivery was complete and the room began to resemble Joan's vision, he started the arduous task of moving their belongings back into the bedroom. The work stretched late into the night, and by midnight, Richard surrendered to exhaustion. Beer in hand, he settled into his lounge chair once more, letting sleep take him. Wednesday, October 6th. Richard began the day early, loading the old furniture into his truck and taking it to Goodwill. On the way back, he treated himself to breakfast at Denny's, enjoying a rare moment of calm. By noon, he was home, fully committed to wrapping up the project. With everything moved back into the bedroom, he added a finishing touch, a large banner draped over the bed that read, "Surprise." Standing back, he felt a surge of satisfaction, until he noticed a foot-long gouge in the paint. "Darn it," he muttered, grabbing a brush to fix the blemish. Later, while cleaning up, he decided to tackle one last chore. He'd been using the bathroom sink to rinse out his paintbrush when it slipped, landing on the small cosmetics case he'd left nearby. Frustrated, Richard wiped off the paint smudges with a rag and some turpentine, restoring the case to its original condition. The case intrigued him more than ever now, and he couldn't shake the urge to look inside. Retrieving an old jar of keys from the garage, he began testing them one by one on the Samsonite locks. Finally, he found one that clicked. Sitting at the kitchen table, Richard braced himself as he prepared to uncover the mystery hidden within. Richard hesitated for a moment before opening the cosmetics case fully. As the lock clicked open, he found a neatly sealed manila envelope lying on top, addressed to Joan from an Stevens in Seattle, dated September 15, 1991. Setting it aside, he dug further and pulled out a blue bikini. For a fleeting moment, he smiled, recalling how Joan used to look in it during their vacations. But what he found beneath it made his heart lurch. A photograph. The image showed Joan kissing another man at a dinner table. Richard's hands trembled as he examined it closer. The man was a stranger, and the intimacy of the kiss left no room for doubt. His mind raced, unable to comprehend why his wife would be with someone else, let alone captured in such a tender moment. A wave of nausea hit him, and he bolted to the bathroom, gripping the sink as he tried to steady his breathing. After a few minutes, he returned to the kitchen, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. Determined to understand what he had just seen, Richard emptied the case's contents onto the living room table and sat down, muttering bitterly about Joan's habit of keeping everything. Piece by piece, he began sorting through the items. Among them was a blue felt jewelry box containing a heart-shaped gold locket, one he vividly remembered Joan wearing to a formal dinner years ago. There were napkins, one with, "I love you," scribbled on it and another with a phone number. He found an invitation to a 1990 award ceremony addressed to Dr. Timothy D. and guest. There was also a dried red rose, matchbooks, hotel receipts, and other memorabilia, each one connecting dots he wasn't ready to piece together. As he sifted through the items, Joan, unaware of her husband's discovery, was on her cruise, trying to call home from the ship's communication office. Frustrated when no one answered, she sent Richard an email describing the fun she was having in teasing about Brenda's antics. Disappointed she couldn't reach him, Joan returned to the pool, oblivious to the storm brewing back home. Meanwhile, Richard woke up the next morning on the living room floor, surrounded by the cosmetics case's damning contents. The pain of betrayal clung to him like a heavy fog. Despite the ache, he knew he couldn't let this discovery paralyze him. He needed answers. "I have to know what this all means and if there's any hope for us," he muttered to himself, gripping Joan's photo. Resolving to uncover the full truth, Richard began examining the letters and keepsakes more closely, occasionally stepping outside to pace, cry, or breathe in the crisp autumn air. By midday, Richard discovered a letter he hadn't seen earlier. It was from Anna Stevens, the sister of the man in the photo, Dr. Timothy D. The letter revealed the devastating truth: Joan had carried on an affair with Timothy for over 3 years. The relationship likely started when Timothy joined the hospital where Joan worked. They met in secret at hotels, in Joan's office, and even during work conferences that Joan had fabricated. The affair continued after Timothy moved to San Diego, with the two meeting during his trips home. As the hours passed, Richard grew more hollow, his reality unraveling with each piece of evidence. By 10 p.m., the entire day had slipped by in a haze of reading and reflection. Overwhelmed, he stepped outside, letting the cool night air wash over him. He left the door ajar, too drained to even care. In the days leading up to Joan's return, Richard threw himself into chores, desperately trying to stave off the crushing weight of betrayal. Joan, on the other hand, grew increasingly worried about not hearing from Richard. She left messages for both him and Mark, asking her son to check on his father, her unease mounting as the silence persisted. The gap between their realities widened with every passing hour, and Richard knew that when Joan finally returned, they would have no choice but to face the truth, and whatever came next. As Joan grew increasingly worried about Richard's silence, her concern reached a breaking point. She hadn't heard from him in days and couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, Joan called Mark, asking him to check on his father. Mark, though annoyed at the request, grudgingly agreed. Muttering under his breath, he drove over to Richard's house, still irritated by the interruption to his day. When he arrived, he pounded on the door repeatedly, but there was no answer. Finally, Richard's voice called out from the backyard. Mark found his father trimming the hedges, seemingly calm but distant. "Dad, Mom's worried about you." "She hasn't heard from you at all," Mark said, trying to gauge his father's mood. Richard waved off the concern. "I've just been busy, son. Tell your mom I'm fine." Mark left feeling uneasy. Something about his father's demeanor seemed off, but he decided not to push further. Meanwhile, Richard was making calculated moves to prepare for the days ahead. Before Joan's return, he planned to have everything finalized, ensuring that he would be long gone when she arrived back home. Later that day, Richard made a significant decision. He called his longtime friend and attorney, Luke Pauley, to arrange a meeting at 1 p.m. Luke agreed, unaware of the full extent of what Richard was about to share. Before the meeting, Richard packed up the few belongings he had at work, ending his 30-year career with the county government. Everything he had accumulated fit into just 2 boxes, a quiet and unceremonious conclusion to his decades of service. After leaving the office, Richard visited the bank to take further steps. He split his funds into a new checking account under his name alone, retrieved his passport and vital documents from the safety deposit box, and applied for a new credit card. Each action was deliberate, a step closer to securing his independence. By the end of the day, he was exhausted but resolute, his mind preoccupied with thoughts about what the future might hold. On Tuesday, October 12th, Richard received yet another voicemail from Joan. He didn't listen to it and didn't respond, knowing he needed to focus on finalizing his preparations. The next day, Wednesday, October 13th, his new credit card arrived, and his financial arrangements were complete. He called Luke again to check on the paperwork but was met with resistance. Luke, concerned about the implications of Richard's actions, had intentionally delayed filing the documents, hoping Richard would reconsider and talk to Joan. Richard was firm in his stance, though. "I don't want her contacting me, Luke. If it's urgent, you can reach me on the landline I gave you, but she cannot know where I am." Reluctantly, Luke agreed, though he still hoped for a resolution. Back on the cruise, Joan's worry had reached a fever pitch. As she and Brenda disembarked on Saturday, October 16th, Joan was certain Richard would be at the airport to greet them. When he wasn't there, she tried calling his cell phone, only to hear it ringing from the counter at home. Frustrated, she sighed. "He forgot it again," she muttered, dismissing the growing unease for a moment. Upstairs, Joan began unpacking her luggage. When she opened the bedroom door, she froze. The sight before her took her breath away. A large banner reading, "Surprise," hung over the bed. The room had been completely transformed, just as she had always dreamed. New furniture, fresh carpeting, and beautiful colors surrounded her. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Rich, you sneaky planner," she whispered, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I can't wait to thank you tonight." But as the hours passed and Richard still didn't come home, Joan's excitement turned to dread. By Sunday, she was overcome with anxiety, spending the entire day crying and praying for his safe return. Brenda suggested calling the police, but when Joan tried, the dispatcher informed her that she needed to wait 24 hours before filing a missing person report. Joan also called local hospitals, fearing the worst, but found no trace of him. Though relieved that he wasn't hurt, her unease grew deeper. The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. On Tuesday, Joan contacted Luke, pleading to know where Richard was, but he insisted he didn't know. "If he signs the papers, I'll let you know," he promised, though his words brought Joan little comfort. Her days became a blur of tears, prayers, and desperate hope. Finally, 10 days later, Joan discovered through Mark that Richard had been staying at Aunt Mary's lake house. Determined to find him, she drove there immediately. When she arrived, she spotted Richard sitting by the water, his shoulders slumped and his face weary. His disheveled appearance startled her. Quietly, she approached and sat beside him. Richard didn't acknowledge her, his gaze fixed on the rippling surface of the lake. The weight of everything unsaid hung between them, but Joan refused to leave. "Rich," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion, "please, talk to me." Richard sat silently by the lake, processing Joan's admission about loving 2 men at once. His mind was racing, but his face remained a mask of calm as Joan tried to explain, her voice cracking with emotion. I loved both of you deeply, Richard. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to solve it. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Suddenly, Richard stood up without a word and began walking toward the house, his movements rigid with purpose. Joan, stunned, got to her feet and followed, but when she reached the door, she found it locked. Richard, she called, but there was no response. Inside, he was already pacing, his thoughts an angry tangle of betrayal and heartbreak. Joan stood outside, tears streaming down her face, unsure of what to do. Eventually, she gave up and sat on the porch, her head in her hands. Hours passed before Richard finally came back outside, his face a storm of emotions. He didn't look at her as he said, "We have an appointment with Dr. Jean Brooks, a marriage counselor. Next Tuesday at 6. He handed her a card with the counselor's information and walked back inside, leaving Joan alone in the dark, clutching the card. The counseling begins. Their first session with Dr. Brooks was tense but productive. The counselor encouraged them to share their feelings without interruptions. Richard spoke first, his voice tight with emotion. You were always my anchor, Joan, but now everything I believed in feels upside down. I don't know what's real anymore. It hurts to even look at you because all I can think about are those letters, and the images of you with him. They haunt me. I don't think you can understand that kind of pain. Joan wiped a tear from her cheek and responded softly, I never stopped loving you, Richard. Even when I was making the worst mistake of my life, I still loved you. But I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. That's why we're here, to figure out how to move forward. The hour flew by, and though progress felt slow, they agreed to follow Dr. Brooks' advice, to spend time discussing their feelings at home but to avoid new topics if emotions ran too high. That evening, Joan suggested they talk in the living room with a glass of wine. I'll need tissues, she said with a faint smile, trying to lighten the mood. Richard agreed but added, let's keep it brief. I'm not sure how much of this I can handle in one night. The struggle to rebuild. For weeks, their evenings became a pattern of careful conversations and tentative steps toward understanding. But tension lingered, especially as Richard struggled to reconcile his feelings. One evening, after an especially difficult session, he finally said, I don't get it. Dr. Brooks said loving two people at once is common, but it feels like nonsense to me. I can understand it logically, but emotionally, it just doesn't make sense. Joan nodded, her voice steady but pained. She didn't mean it's right, Richard. She meant it happens, even when we don't want it to. But I never stopped loving you, and I'm here now, trying to fix what I broke. Despite Joan's reassurances, Richard's wounds ran deep. Every time I look at you, I wonder if there's more I don't know. How many others were there, Joan? How many secrets are hidden in this house? Her expression hardened. What are you accusing me of? There was no one else, Richard. I've told you everything. Richard shook his head, frustration etched across his face. It's not just about what you say, Joan. It's about what I see in my mind, the images of you with him. They make me physically sick. Joan reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Rich, we need to talk to Dr. Brooks about dealing with those thoughts. For now, let's focus on being together. Maybe we could take a few days off, go to the mountains, and just be us without the pressure of everything hanging over us. Richard hesitated, then shook his head. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. He stood and left for bed, leaving Joan alone with her thoughts and the weight of their fractured marriage. 8 weeks later. After 2 months of counseling, the strain between them had eased slightly, though the scars were still visible. One evening, sitting in the living room after another difficult session, Richard broke the silence. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened, Joan. But I know I still love you. I don't know how to let this go, but I also don't know how to let you go. Joan looked at him, tears filling her eyes. I love you too, Rich. I know I've destroyed so much, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. I just need you to let me try. For the first time in weeks, Richard reached for her hand, holding it tightly. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step, a fragile hope that, maybe, they could find their way back to each other. Richard sat across from Joan in the dim light of their living room, the tension palpable between them. Joan's voice trembled with emotion as she tried to explain what he struggled to comprehend. I loved you and Tim simultaneously, Richard. I know it's hard to understand, but that kind of love usually ends with someone getting hurt, and we were both hurt. Richard's jaw tightened as he looked at her. You're telling me you felt the same way about him that you feel about me? That losing either of us would devastate you? Joan nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes. That's exactly it. You've been trying to make sense of how I could love two men at once, but you don't see how losing one of you would have left me shattered. If Tim had died, I would have grieved. And if I had lost you, Rich, I don't think I could have survived that. Richard leaned back, rubbing his temples as Joan continued. You had no one to grieve with, Rich. You carried your pain alone because you couldn't share it with me without losing me. I understand now why you were so depressed back then. I would have been too if I'd lost you. Richard sighed deeply, his voice quieter now. I'm sorry for the way I said things earlier. I didn't mean to make it worse. But Joan, sometimes it feels like you don't realize how much this has gutted me. Every time I try to move forward, the thought of you with him pulls me back. Joan looked at him, her voice breaking. Oh, Rich, you can be so stubborn sometimes. I know this hasn't been easy for you, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But please understand that loving him didn't mean I loved you any less. You've always been my anchor. Richard stood abruptly, his emotions swirling too wildly to stay seated. You've always been my world, Joan, he said softly, almost to himself, before retreating upstairs and quietly closing the bedroom door behind him. 8 weeks later, their sessions with Dr. Brooks had brought some clarity but left many emotions raw and unresolved. One evening, Joan finally let her frustration show. I can't talk to you tonight, Rich, she snapped, her voice tight with anger. You make me so mad I could strangle you. You wanted a divorce without even talking to me? Are you crazy? We've talked about everything since we got married, and now, when everything's on the line, you want to handle this alone. Richard sat in stunned silence as Joan stormed upstairs. He sank into the couch, nursing a beer and staring blankly at the wall. The next morning, when Joan came downstairs, her face was puffy, and her eyes were bloodshot. She sat beside him and spoke quietly, her tone filled with regret. I'm sorry, Rich. I'm still trying to see things from your perspective. I know I haven't made it easy for you. Richard smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he'd managed in days. It's okay. I struggle with it too. Sometimes, I say things without thinking about how they'll sound to you or how they'll make you feel. I'm sorry for that. Joan's lips curled into a faint smile as she looked at him. We should write that down for Dr. Brooks. I think she'll want us to work on that together. That evening, after dinner, Richard returned to the living room with a glass of wine for Joan and a soda for himself. He found her on the couch, her head back, eyes closed. For a moment, he considered quietly covering her with a blanket and heading to bed, but her eyes fluttered open, and she gave him the crooked smile that had first caught his attention in high school. Okay, hon, she said, patting the spot next to her. Where do you want to start? Richard hesitated, then sat down. How about this, he said carefully. Explain what you meant when you said Tim rocked your world differently than I do. I thought what we had was everything. Joan's expression softened as she reached for his hand. Rich, what we have is everything. It's home. It's safety. It's love that's grown and lasted. But Tim, he was different. It wasn't better, just different. It's hard to explain. Richard leaned back, a pang of jealousy cutting through his chest. You loved him, but you wouldn't leave me for him. Why not? Joan squeezed his hand tightly. Because I've never wanted a life without you, Rich. Even when I was caught up in that mess, I couldn't imagine giving you up. You've always been my world. Richard looked at her, his voice low but firm. We haven't resolved that yet, Joan. I need to understand how you could love him and still look me in the eye every day. We need to get through this, completely, if we're ever going to move forward. Joan nodded. We'll get there, Rich. But for now, let's just start with tonight. Joan sat on the edge of the couch, her hands nervously wringing together as she tried to find the right words. Rich, she began softly, when I was with him, it wasn't about not loving you. I gave myself to you and to him, but it was different. We had different ways of connecting, different things that excited us. But in the end, I made love to you both because I loved you both. Does that make sense? Richard stared at the floor, his face unreadable. After a long pause, he muttered, I guess. But I don't know, Joan. I'm still struggling to get the image of you with another man out of my mind. I don't know if I'll ever get over it. Every time I look at you, it's there. Joan reached for his hand, but Richard pulled away, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his pain. I wish you could understand how much that image haunts me, he said quietly. I'm trying, but it's like it's burned into my mind. At their next session with Dr. Brooks, Richard's feelings came pouring out. I feel like I've been thrown into a nightmare, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I accidentally found out about the relationship, Joan. You didn't tell me. If you had been honest back then, I would have divorced you immediately. The pain would have been bad, but at least I wouldn't have spent years living a lie. Joan's eyes filled with tears as she listened, but she didn't interrupt. Richard continued, I don't know what I did wrong as a husband to make you turn to someone else. It's been a year of agony since I found out. And the worst part? I don't trust you anymore. I don't know how to trust you. Dr. Brooks interjected gently, Richard, those feelings are valid, and it's clear you've both been carrying immense pain. But I want to remind you, this kind of healing takes time. You've made progress, even if it doesn't feel like it. Richard let out a bitter laugh. Progress? This past weekend was awkward at best, he said. We're still carrying so much baggage, tripping over it every step of the way. Joan turned to him, her voice steady despite the tears. We will get better, Rich. I promise. I love you, and I will do whatever it takes to make you feel safe with me again. I don't want to lose you. Richard didn't reply immediately, his gaze focused somewhere distant. Finally, he said, I gave you everything, Joan, my all. But if I stay, I'll always feel like the man who wasn't fully loved by his wife. A few days later, Richard found himself sitting alone in his new condo, a half-empty box of unpacked belongings on the floor beside him. The divorce papers had been filed, and the division of their assets was underway. Richard had taken his share of the money, leaving the house to be dealt with. He chose not to answer Joan's calls or messages, despite her repeated attempts to reach him. Their son, Mark, tried to mediate, calling Richard to ask him to reconsider. But Richard's response was blunt. Mark, he said, his voice firm, what would you do if, after years of bliss, you woke up in a nightmare? Would you choose to keep living in it? Mark had no answer, and after a moment of silence, Richard ended the call. For the first time in a long while, Richard stepped out onto the balcony of his condo and felt the cool air on his face. It was quiet, peaceful. For the first time in what felt like ages, he felt something resembling freedom. Joan, meanwhile, sat alone in the house they had once shared, tears streaking her face as she stared at the divorce papers on the table. Richard didn't look back. For him, the chapter had ended. Whether he would find peace in the days to come, only time would tell.